Imagine a world where a single bowl of porridge determined the fate of a revolution, and a shortage of salt could cause an entire army to collapse. You've been told the story of the American Revolution through muskets and speeches, but the real history of the United States wasn't written in ink. It was carved into the dinner tables of the 13 colonies. From the starving winters of Jamestown to the rum-soaked taverns of Boston, what early Americans ate didn't just keep them alive, it defined their rebellion, their economy, and their very identity. This is the grit, the grease, and the glory of the food that built a superpower. The starving roots of a nation. In the early 1600s, the Atlantic Ocean was a terrifying, watery void that separated the Old World from a New World that was in reality ancient and deeply inhabited. When the first English settlers stepped off their ships in Jamestown, Virginia, they didn't find a land of milk and honey. They found a harsh, unforgiving landscape that they were entirely unprepared to harvest. The initial dream of the Virginia Company wasn't agriculture, it was gold. This fundamental misunderstanding of the land led to what historians call the starving time. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, the colony nearly vanished. Of the 500 residents alive in the fall, only 60 survived until spring. The plights of these early colonists were harrowing. When the stored grain ran out and the livestock, horses, dogs, and cats were consumed, the settlers turned to things that would make a modern stomach turn. Archaeological evidence suggests they boiled leather boots for the collagen and, in the darkest hours of that winter, resorted to cannibalism. This wasn't just a failure of logistics, it was a clash of dietary cultures. The English insisted on growing wheat in soil that demanded maize, corn, and they refused to learn the sophisticated fishing and hunting techniques of the Powhatan people until it was almost too late. The turning point for the American plate wasn't the discovery of gold, but the begrudging acceptance of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. These three crops, perfected by indigenous peoples over millennia, provided a sustainable nutritional foundation. Corn provided the carbohydrates, beans fixed nitrogen in the soil and provided protein, and squash acted as a living mulch to keep the ground moist. Once the settlers swallowed their pride and began to plant corn, the survival of the colonies was finally anchored. However, as the colonies grew, food became more than just survival. It became a tool of British imperialism. The mercantile system dictated that the colonies exist solely to provide raw materials to the crown and to consume British manufactured goods. This meant that even the salt used to preserve American meat often had to come from British-controlled sources. Every bite a colonist took was in some way taxed or regulated by a king thousands of miles away. This tension between the abundance of the American wilderness and the restrictions of British law began to simmer in the kitchens of New England and the plantations of the South long before the first shot was fired at Lexington. The liquid fire of rebellion. While corn and salt pork provided the calories for survival, it was a liquid commodity that truly lubricated the wheels of American commerce and descent: rum. By the mid-17th century, rum was the most important manufactured good in New England. It wasn't just a drink, it was a currency, a social lubricant, and eventually a political explosive. To understand the American plate, one must understand the triangle trade, a brutal and complex economic engine that linked the molasses of the West Indies to the distilleries of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. The average colonist consumed an astonishing amount of alcohol, roughly 3 times what the average American drinks today. Rum was served at breakfast, used as a medicinal tonic, and given to laborers as part of their wages. However, this dependency created a massive strategic vulnerability. In 1733 and again in 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act, aiming to tax the molasses imported from non-British islands. For the distillers of Boston and Newport, this wasn't just a tax on a luxury, it was an existential threat to their entire way of life. The cry of no taxation without representation was first whispered over glasses of punch in the dark corners of taverns like the Green Dragon in Boston. The king's salt and the people's meat. As the colonies pushed further inland, a new dietary challenge emerged, the preservation of protein. In an era without refrigeration, salt was the white gold of the frontier. To keep a family fed through the winter, an enormous amount of salt was required to cure beef, pork, and fish. Most of this salt was imported from British-controlled solar works in the Caribbean or from Europe. The British leadership understood this dependency perfectly. When the winds of revolution began to blow, one of the first strategies of the Royal Navy was to blockade the coast and cut off the supply of salt. They knew that a starving population is submissive. If a farmer couldn't salt his hog, his family would starve by February. This led to a desperate homegrown American industry. Colonists began boiling hundreds of gallons of seawater in massive iron vats to produce just a few pounds of salt, a grueling, wood-intensive process that reshaped the coastal forests. Furthermore, the colonial plate was becoming increasingly distinct from the British one. In England, meat was a luxury for the elite. The commoner lived on bread and pottage. In the American colonies, however, the vast forests were teeming with deer, turkey, and wild boar. The protein-rich diet of the average American made them, on average, 2 inches taller than their British counterparts. When the Redcoats finally arrived to suppress the rebellion, they found themselves facing rebels who were physically larger and had better eyesight, largely due to a diet of game and maize rather than the nutrient-deficient wheat of the London slums. The American identity was being forged in the calorie. The abundance of the land gave the colonists a sense of physical independence long before they declared political independence. They were no longer British subjects eating the king's crumbs. They were Americans eating the bounty of a continent. The Great Morning Pivot. While rum was the fuel of the tavern, tea was the glue of the colonial household. By the 1770s, tea was merely a beverage. It was a ritual of civilization. In the drawing rooms of Philadelphia and the parlors of Charleston, the ability to serve tea in fine porcelain was the ultimate mark of status. But for the British Crown, tea was a convenient vessel for asserting control. When the Tea Act of 1733 granted the struggling East India Company a monopoly on tea sales to the colonies, it wasn't just about the price, it was about the principle of who controlled the American palate. The Boston Tea Party is often remembered as a moment of rowdy vandalism, but its nutritional aftermath was a cultural earthquake. To drink tea was suddenly seen as an act of treason against one's neighbors. This created a massive void in the American morning. The solution? Coffee. While coffee had been present in the colonies, it was seen as a secondary, bitter alternative to the refined taste of bohea or souchong. But as the boycott took hold, drinking coffee became a patriotic duty. The transition wasn't easy. Coffee beans came raw and green, requiring careful roasting over open hearths and laborious hand grinding. Yet this shift changed the American temperament. Unlike the sedative, social nature of the tea ceremony, coffee provided a high-octane caffeine jolt that suited the frantic energy of a budding revolution. The coffee house replaced the tea room, becoming a hub for merchants, spies, and radicals to exchange newspapers and plot the overthrow of the monarchy. The plantation plate and the hidden influence. While the northern colonies were debating over coffee and rum, the South was developing a culinary system that would eventually become the backbone of American cuisine, though its origins were often ignored by history. The wealth of the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, was built on cash crops like tobacco and indigo, but the people were fed by the ingenuity of the enslaved African population. Enslaved people were often given the refuse of the plantation, pig's feet, entrails, chitterlings, and turnip greens. Through sheer survivalist brilliance, they transformed these unwanted scraps into high-flavor, nutrient-dense dishes using techniques brought from West Africa.
They introduced okra, black-eyed peas, and watermelon to the American soil. Perhaps most importantly, they revolutionized the way the colonies used rice. In the swampy low country of South Carolina, Carolina gold rice became a global commodity. The British didn't have the expertise to grow rice in standing water. That knowledge came entirely from enslaved people from the rice coast of Africa, modern-day Senegal and Gambia. This hidden plate was incredibly sophisticated, blending African spices and slow cooking methods with local American ingredients.
By the mid-1700s, the colonial plate was a melting pot of 3 continents. The indigenous corn, the European livestock, and the African seasoning were merging into a singular, complex foodway. However, this fusion was born of tension. The plantation owners grew rich on the labor of those who cooked their meals, and the disparity between the big house table, laden with imported wines and roasted game, and the slave quarters hearth became a visual representation of the deep moral fractures that would later haunt the nation. The hunger of liberty. As the year 1775 bled into 1776, the philosophical debates of the Continental Congress met the harsh reality of the battlefield. George Washington, newly appointed commander-in-chief, quickly realized that his greatest enemy wasn't the British bayonet, it was the empty stomach. A soldier requires roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day to remain effective in the field, especially during the brutal winters of the Northeast. The plate of the Revolution was supposed to consist of a pound of beef, a pound of flour, and a gill of rum daily. In reality, it was often nothing more than fire cake. Fire cake was a desperate invention of necessity. It was a simple mixture of flour and water, stirred into a thick paste and baked on a flat rock over a campfire. It was flavorless, hard as a brick, and provided little more than a heavy lump of carbohydrates. Without yeast, salt, or fat, the soldiers' digestive system struggled. At Valley Forge, the smell of charred flour and wood smoke became the scent of the American struggle. The logistics of feeding the Continental Army were a nightmare. The colonies had plenty of food, but no unified way to transport it. The British occupied the major ports, and the continental dollar was inflating so rapidly that farmers often preferred to sell their grain to the British for gold rather than to Washington's starving troops for paper. This led to a bitter irony. The very land that was famed for its abundance was failing its liberators because of the lack of a functional supply chain. The preservation crisis and the rise of the cured South. While the soldiers suffered, the home front was undergoing a radical shift in food technology. With the British blockade cutting off European trade, Americans had to double down on preservation. This era saw the perfection of the smokehouse. In the southern and mid-Atlantic colonies, the smokehouse became a temple of survival. Pork was the primary victim and hero of this process. The American hog was a different beast from its European ancestors. Left to roam the woods and eat acorns and chestnuts, these semi-wild pigs developed a lean, flavorful meat. Once slaughtered in the hog killing time of late autumn, every part of the animal was used. The hams were rubbed with salt and brown sugar, then hung in small windowless wooden buildings where hickory or oak fires smoldered for weeks. The smoke didn't just add flavor, it deposited chemicals like formaldehyde and acetic acid onto the meat, creating an antimicrobial barrier. A well-smoked ham could last for 2 years without refrigeration. This cured lifestyle allowed the American population to remain mobile. A pioneer or a scout could carry a slab of smoked bacon in his pack for weeks, providing the high-fat energy needed to scout the Appalachian frontiers.
However, the lack of salt remained a national security issue. Without it, the smokehouse was useless. This desperation led to the first major industrial ventures in the new United States, the development of inland salt springs, like those in Kanawha, modern-day West Virginia. The American plate was moving away from the coast, literally and figuratively, as the search for food security pushed the borders of the nation westward. The egalitarian table and the one-pot revolution. As the smoke of the revolution cleared, a new social order began to emerge, and nowhere was this more visible than in the kitchens of the North. Unlike the rigid, multi-course dining hierarchies of Europe, where the elite ate delicate jellies and the poor ate crusts, the American household was beginning to favor a more practical, level approach to dining. Because labor was expensive and the servant class was smaller in the North, the American housewife became the architect of the one-pot meal. The center of the colonial home was the hearth, a massive stone fireplace that served as the furnace, the light source, and the stove. Hanging from a rotating iron crane was the great pot, a heavy cast-iron cauldron. Into this pot went whatever was available: dried beans, salted pork, root vegetables, and cornmeal. This created the legendary New England boiled dinner and various stews that could simmer for days. This style of cooking was inherently democratic. Everyone in the house, from the head of the family to the youngest apprentice, often ate from the same pot. It was a communal experience that broke down European notions of fine dining. It also gave rise to the Dutch oven, a thick-walled cooking pot with a flanged lid designed to hold hot coals. This single piece of technology allowed Americans to bake bread, roast meats, and stew vegetables all in one vessel, making it the most essential tool for the westward expansion that was about to begin. The sweet seduction of maple and honey. While the British had used sugar as a tool of economic control, Americans looked to their own backyards to satisfy their legendary sweet tooth. In the Northeast, the colonists learned the art of sugar making from the indigenous peoples. Each spring, during the sugar bush season, families would tap maple trees to collect the sap. This wasn't just a treat, it was a political statement. Using maple sugar instead of West Indian cane sugar was a way to boycott the British slave trade economy. However, further south and in the mid-Atlantic, a different sweet gold was being harvested: honey. The European honeybee was not native to North America. It was brought over by early settlers and nicknamed the white man's fly by Native Americans. These bees thrived in the American wilderness, pollinating the new orchards of apples and peaches that were being planted across the colonies. The combination of wild fruits and local sweeteners gave birth to the American pie. In England, pies were often savory, meat-filled coffins with a hard, inedible crust. In the colonies, the crust became flaky and buttery, thanks to the abundance of lard from the smokehouse, and the fillings became sweet and fruit-centric. The apple pie, often cited as the quintessence of American identity, was actually a masterclass in colonial adaptation, taking an English concept, using a German-style crust, and filling it with fruit from a tree that had traveled across the Atlantic to find its home in American soil. By the late 1700s, the American plate was no longer a poor imitation of Europe. It was a high-calorie, high-flavor, and highly independent system. The stage was set for the next great challenge: how to feed a nation that was moving faster than its crops could grow. The liquid gold of the frontier. By the 1790s, the American experiment faced a new crisis, and once again it was rooted in the logistics of the plate. As settlers pushed past the Appalachian Mountains into the fertile Ohio River Valley, they discovered a paradise for growing grain. However, they faced a crushing geographic reality. It was too expensive to haul heavy sacks of grain back over the mountains to the coastal cities. A horse would eat more grain during the journey than it could carry to market. The solution was as practical as it was potent: distillation. By turning their surplus grain into whiskey, farmers condensed a bulky, perishable crop into a high-value, portable liquid. A single pack horse could carry 24 bushels of grain if it were converted into 2 kegs of whiskey. On the frontier, whiskey became the universal currency. It was used to pay for land, marriage licenses, and even the services of a traveling preacher. When Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, imposed an excise tax on whiskey to pay off war debts, the frontier erupted. To the farmers of western Pennsylvania, this wasn't just a tax on a drink, it was a tax on their very ability to survive. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was the first major test of the new U.S. government. It proved that in America, food and the alcohol derived from it were inextricably linked to the concept of liberty. The rebellion was suppressed, but the legacy remained. Americans had developed a taste for bourbon, corn-based whiskey, moving away.
That to claim a piece of land under the homesteading laws of the time, settlers often had to plant a certain number of fruit trees to prove they intended to stay. But the apples Chapman planted weren't the sweet, shiny, red, delicious apples we find in modern grocery stores. They were small, tart, and spicked bitter. These were cider apples. In the early 1800s, water was often unsafe to drink due to parasites and bacteria. Hard cider, with its low alcohol content, was the daily hydrator for the American family. Children drank ciderkin, a watered-down version, with breakfast. The apple tree became the symbol of the American civilized wilderness. An orchard meant permanence. It meant that the family intended to stay long enough for the sapling to bear fruit. These orchards provided more than just drink. They provided vinegar for pickling, pectin for jams, and livestock feed for the winter. The American plate was being anchored by the root systems of millions of apple trees, turning the rugged Wild West into a series of productive, fruit-bearing homesteads. The rise of the American tavern. As the nation expanded, the tavern became the most important social institution in America. Whether it was the high-end City Tavern in Philadelphia or a rough log cabin inn on the Wilderness Road, the tavern was where the American plate met the American public. Dining in a colonial or early federal tavern was a family-style affair. There were no private tables or menus. At the sound of a bell, all guests sat at a long communal table. You ate what the innkeeper's wife had prepared that day, usually a massive roast, a bowl of peas, and a stack of hoe cakes, cornmeal patties cooked on the flat of a garden hoe. This communal dining style fostered a unique American trait, the mixing of social classes. A wealthy merchant might find himself rubbing elbows with a muddy teamster or a traveling surveyor. They shared the same bread, drank from the same tankard, and discussed the same politics. This tavern culture solidified the American identity as one that was loud, opinionated, and fundamentally centered around the sharing of a heavy, protein-rich meal. The spice seekers of Salem. While the interior of the continent was being conquered by corn and whiskey, the coastal cities were looking eastward across the vast oceans. In the late 1970s and early 1800s, the tiny port of Salem, Massachusetts, became the unlikely gateway to the Orient. The American plate, though hearty, was fundamentally bland, heavy on salt and smoke, but lacking in complexity. The pursuit of black pepper changed everything. At one point, Salem was the wealthiest city per capita in America, and it was all built on the pepper trade with Sumatra. American captains risked pirates, monsoons, and uncharted reefs to bring back barrels of peppercorns, cloves, and nutmeg.
These weren't just seasonings, they were symbols of the new republic's global reach. Spices allowed for the preservation of meats that were slightly past their prime and added a layer of sophistication to the American table. Nutmeg, in particular, became an obsession. Almost every wealthy American carried a pocket nutmeg grater, a small silver or bone case with a tiny grater inside to season their wine, punch, and porridge on the go. This era marked the birth of the American merchant prince, men who built mansions in New England fueled by the heat of Indonesian peppers. The Dairy Revolution and the common cow. As the 19th century dawned, the American plate saw a massive influx of white, dairy. In the early colonial days, cows were primarily kept for muscle, oxen, or leather. Milk was a seasonal luxury because cows didn't produce year-round without high-quality winter feed. However, with the improvement of pastures and the breeding of milch cows, the American diet became drenched in butter and cheese. The cheese circuit became a vital part of the rural economy. In places like Vermont and upstate New York, farm women became the primary breadwinners by producing massive wheels of cheddar-style cheese. These wheels were sturdy enough to be shipped to the growing cities or even back to England. Butter, meanwhile, became the ultimate American indulgence. European travelers were often shocked and disgusted by the amount of butter Americans consumed. It wasn't just a spread, it was a cooking medium. Meats were potted in butter, vegetables were drowned in it, and pastries were saturated with it. This abundance of fat provided the high caloric intake necessary for a population that was clearing forests and building cities by hand. The American glow that foreigners noted was often just a thin sheen of butter and the health that came with a high-protein, high-fat diet. The kitchen of the industrial dawn. By the 1820s, the physical landscape of the American kitchen was changing. For 2 centuries, the open hearth had been the center of the home. But the invention of cast-iron cook stove revolutionized how Americans interacted with their food. The stove allowed for multiple pots to be heated at different temperatures simultaneously, leading to the development of sides, separate dishes of vegetables, grains, and sauces that replaced the old one-pot stews. This technological shift coincided with the rise of the first American celebrity catches and cookbook authors, like Amelia Simmons, who wrote American Cookery. Her book was the first to substitute American ingredients for British ones, using cornmeal instead of oats, and pearl ash, a precursor to baking powder, instead of expensive yeast. The American plate was no longer a survival kit or a British imitation. It was becoming a science. We were moving into an era of refinement, where the crude foods of the frontier were being polished into a national cuisine. The table was set, the spices were stocked, and the fire was now contained within iron walls. The nation was fueled and ready for the explosive growth of the mid-19th century. The oyster craze, the original fast food. If you walked through the streets of New York, Baltimore, or Philadelphia in the early 1830s, the most dominant smell wouldn't have been horse manure or coal smoke. It would have been the briny, sharp scent of oysters. Today, oysters are a luxury, a high-priced delicacy served on beds of ice in upscale bistros. But in early America, they were the protein of the people. The harbors of the East Coast, particularly the Chesapeake Bay and the Hudson River, were once paved with oyster reefs so massive they were hazards to navigation. These weren't small, dainty shells we see today. Some colonial-era oysters were reported to be the size of dinner plates. Because they were so abundant, they were incredibly cheap. For a few pennies, a laborer could walk into an oyster cellar, a basement establishment marked by a red-painted muslin lantern, and eat as much as you can bolt. Oysters were prepared in every imaginable way: pickled, fried, stewed, or baked into oyster loaves, hollowed-out bread stuffed with fried oysters. They were the first true fast food of the American working class. They provided a massive boost of zinc, iron, and protein to a population that was beginning to move from the farms to the factories. The shell piles behind these oyster houses grew so large that they were eventually crushed and used as paving material for the very streets of Manhattan and Washington, D.C. The Ice King and the Cold Revolution. Up until the mid-19th century, fresh was a relative term. Meat was eaten immediately after slaughter or preserved in salt. But a visionary entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor, known as the Ice King, changed the temperature of the American plate forever. Tudor realized that the frozen lakes of New England held a crop that could be harvested and sold to the sweltering South and the Caribbean. Using specialized horse-drawn ice cutters, workers would saw massive blocks of ice from ponds in Massachusetts. These blocks were insulated with sawdust and shipped in the holds of vessels. Initially, people laughed at Tudor. Who would buy cold water? But once the American public tasted their first chilled drink, or more importantly, their first dish of ice cream, there was no turning back. The availability of ice meant that for the first time, dairy and meat could be kept fresh for days rather than hours. It gave rise to the icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with zinc or tin that held a block of ice at the top. This shifted the American diet toward more fragile foods. Salads became more common, and the heavy, over-salted meats of the previous century began to give way to fresher, more nuanced flavors. The American plate was literally cooling down, allowing for a more diverse and colorful array of ingredients.
The salted pork of the Civil War. As the 1860s approached, the nation's political tensions finally fractured into the Civil War. Once again, the survival of the Republic rested on the logistics of the plate. For the Union soldier, the defining meal was hardtack and salt pork. Hardtack was a simple cracker made of flour and water, baked so hard that it was nicknamed molar breakers or sheet iron crackers. Soldiers often had to soak them in coffee just to make them edible, and it was common to find weevils living inside them. In the South, the situation was far more dire. The Union's Anaconda Plan blockaded southern ports, cutting off the supply of salt. Without salt, the Confederacy could not preserve the meat from its millions of hogs. This salt famine was a primary factor in the collapse of the Confederate home front. Soldiers deserted not because they lost heart, but because they received letters from home saying their families were starving. The war accelerated food technology in a way peace never could. It saw the first large-scale use of canned goods. Gail Borden's condensed milk became a staple for Union troops, providing a safe, calorie-dense dairy source that wouldn't spoil on the march. The war forced the American plate into a tin can, setting the stage for the industrial, processed food system that would dominate the 20th century. The Great Beef Stampede. After the Civil War, the American plate underwent its most dramatic transformation yet. For 2 centuries, pork had been the undisputed king of the kitchen because pigs were easy to raise and easy to salt. But as the iron rails of the railroad began to stretch across the Great Plains, a new titan emerged: beef. In the vast, unfenced grasslands of Texas, millions of longhorn cattle were wandering wild. They were meat on the hoof, worth $4 in Texas, but $40 in the hungry cities of the North. The era of the great cattle drives began. Cowboys, a diverse group of African Americans, Mexicans, and Civil War veterans, pushed massive herds northward to railhead towns like Abilene and Dodge City. This wasn't just a romantic adventure, it was a massive industrial bypass. The railroad allowed for the creation of centralized slaughterhouses in Chicago, led by moguls like Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour. The invention of the refrigerated rail car in the 1870s was the final piece of the puzzle. Previously, cattle had to be shipped alive, a process that was expensive and caused the animals to lose weight and quality.
Now, beef could be slaughtered in Chicago and shipped in chilled reefers to every corner of the country. For the first time in history, fresh beef became affordable for the middle class. The steakhouse was born, and the American identity shifted from the humble corn-fed hog to the bold, grass-fed, and later grain-finished steer. The golden grain and the mechanical reaper. While beef was conquering the plate, the foundation of the meal, bread, was being revolutionized by the steel plow and the McCormick reaper. Before this, harvesting wheat was a back-breaking task done by hand with a scythe. A single farmer could only manage a few acres, but with the mechanical reaper, a farmer could harvest 10 times the amount in the same period. This created a grain tsunami. The Midwest became the breadbasket of the world. However, this abundance had a side effect, the decline of genetic diversity. Farmers moved away from the dozens of local wheat varieties to focus on high-yield, hard red winter wheat, which was perfect for the industrial mills of Minneapolis. The American loaf changed. It went from the dense, hearty, locally milled bread of the Colonial era to the light, airy, bleached white flour bread of the industrial age. To the 19th century mind, white bread was a symbol of purity and progress, a sign that America had finally conquered the wilderness. But in this transition, the nutritional grit of the early American plate was being sifted out in favor of shelf life and soft textures. The rise of the brand name. By the late 1800s, the American kitchen was no longer an island of self-sufficiency. The general store was being replaced by the grocery store, and the contents of the pantry were beginning to look familiar to a modern eye. This was the era of the brand name. Fearing the lack of regulation in processed foods, where raspberry jam was often just colored glucose and hayseeds, consumers began to trust specific labels. In 1869, H.J. Heinz began selling horseradish in clear glass bottles to prove he wasn't padding his product with fillers. In 1997, a cough syrup manufacturer in New York trademarked a fruit-flavored gelatin called Jell-O. These products promised something revolutionary to the American housewife: consistency. No matter where you were, from a mining camp in Colorado to a brownstone in Brooklyn, a bottle of Heinz ketchup or a box of Quaker Oats would taste exactly the same. The American plate had become standardized. The flavor of America was no longer a regional secret held by a grandmother in Virginia. It was a formula developed in a laboratory and printed on a colorful label. The nation was fed, fueled, and unified by its stomach, ready to enter a century where the biggest challenge wouldn't be finding enough to eat, but managing the overwhelming abundance of the industrial machine. The great melting pot on the plate. At the turn of the 20th century, the American plate underwent a radical seasoning. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants arrived at ports like Ellis Island, and they brought more than just their labor. They brought their seeds, their spices, and their ancestral techniques. Before this wave, American food was largely a variation of British, German, and African traditions. Suddenly, the air in American cities was thick with the scent of garlic, ginger, and cumin. Italian immigrants from the South brought the tomato revolution. While Americans had grown tomatoes for decades, they were often treated with suspicion or eaten plain. The Italians introduced the concept of Sunday gravy, slow-cooked tomato sauces infused with basil and oregano. They turned the hard industrial wheat of the Midwest into pasta, providing a cheap, filling, and flavorful meal for the urban working class. Meanwhile, in the Jewish delis of New York's Lower East Side, pastrami and rye became the new fuel for the garment district, introducing the concept of the overstuffed sandwich as a symbol of American abundance. In the West, Chinese immigrants, who had been essential in building the Transcontinental Railroad, faced intense discrimination but managed to transform the American palate through chop suey. This pseudo-Chinese dish was a brilliant adaptation, using local American vegetables and scraps of meat cooked quickly in a wok. It was the first exotic food to become a mainstream American obsession, proving that the American stomach was often more open-minded than American politics. The birth of the breakfast cereal. As the pace of life accelerated in the industrial city, the traditional heavy American breakfast of steak, eggs, and porridge became too slow for the factory clock. Enter the Seventh-day Adventists in Battle Creek, Michigan. Driven by a belief that plain food would lead to a more moral life, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg and his brother, Will Keith Kellogg, accidentally discovered the process of flaking grain. Cornflakes were born out of a desire for health and purity, but they became a massive commercial success because they were ready to eat. Combined with the growing availability of cold milk, thanks to the Ice King's legacy, cereal changed the American morning. It was the first time a meal was marketed directly to children, using colorful boxes and mascots. The American plate was becoming increasingly processed, sugary, and efficient, trading the slow calories of the hearth for the quick energy of the box. The Great War and the Victory Garden. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, the American plate became a weapon of war. The slogan was simple: "Food will win the war." Herbert Hoover, head of the U.S. Food Administration, convinced Americans to adopt wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Mondays so that high-calorie staples could be shipped to soldiers and starving allies in Europe. This era saw the rise of the Victory Garden. Millions of Americans turned their backyards, vacant lots, and even public parks into vegetable patches. This wasn't just about nutrition, it was about psychological mobilization. For the first time, the colonial spirit of self-sufficiency was revived on a national scale. Americans rediscovered the taste of fresh, homegrown produce.